This chapter is going to be all about muscle. We're going to start with the gross structures of the muscles, work our way down to the microscopic, and then even the molecular levels, and talk about exactly how a muscle contracts. But first, let's start with an awkward Yeti cartoon with the brain saying, "Look at good skeletal muscle, the exercise seems to be paying off. Every moment is agony. That means it's working. Help me." I think we all know how that feels. All right, so skeletal muscles are what we call voluntary, meaning that you can move them voluntarily. We talked about this before. You remember that you can move skeletal muscles consciously or unconsciously. And you remember that the heart and digestive muscles are involuntary. They contract on their own. In fact, the digestive muscles have their own separate myenteric nerve plexus to control their contractions. So all the involuntary muscles, the heart and the smooth muscles, those are all going to be controlled by the involuntary nervous system. So, but this chapter, we're going to talk just about the skeletal muscles. And I know the chapter in your textbook includes the cardiac and smooth muscles. Since we talked about those in other places, I'm not going to cover them. All right, so what is the function of muscles? Well, primarily to move your body around, to maintain your posture, keep you sitting or standing upright and make sure you don't fall over. Also helping with temperature regulation, shivering when you're cold, that's an important muscular function. Supporting the abdominal cavity, the organs inside your abdominal cavity, making sure they don't fall out the front or fall out the pelvic cavity through the bottom. Now, a couple of terms that we need when we're learning about the muscles. The first is agonist. An agonist is the main muscle that does a particular motion. So the biceps brachii muscle is the agonist of elbow flexion, especially when your hand is supinated. So it's the main muscle that bends your arm at the elbow. That's the agonist. The antagonist is a muscle that works against the agonist. So whether a muscle is the agonist or antagonist depends on which movement we're talking about. If we're talking about elbow flexion, then the biceps brachii is the agonist and the triceps brachii is the antagonist. But if we're talking about elbow extension, then the triceps brachii is the agonist and the biceps brachii becomes the antagonist. Okay, so it depends on which movement we're talking about. There's one other term, and that's the synergist, and a synergist is a little helper muscle. Synergists are smaller muscles that help the agonist do their job or stabilize a joint or a structure. So the brachialis muscle is a synergist to the biceps brachii during elbow flexion when the hand is supinated. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the arm muscles. You already know that tendons are the strands of connective tissue that connect muscle to bone. They do sometimes also connect muscles to each other. And there are some muscles, especially the muscles on the face, that actually connect to the fascia, the tissues under the skin. We'll talk about that more when we talk about those muscles. Muscles that have two sections held together by a tendon, that tendon is usually wide and flat, and it's called an aponeurosis, which is a very complicated word, but practice saying it, aponeurosis. So you have an epicranial aponeurosis that connects the frontalis and occipitalis muscles, and it is this wide band of tendon that goes all the way across your skull. And then your abdominal muscles have an abdominal aponeurosis that goes horizontally across the center of your abdominals. You do have one muscle, the rectus abdominis, that goes down the center, that is surrounded by the aponeuroses of the other layers of the abdominal muscles. And we'll talk about those when we get there. Now, one other set of terms we need to know are origin and insertion. The origin is the name we give to the less mobile part of a muscle. The insertion is the name we give to the more mobile part of the muscle. So we say that the insertion moves toward the origin. Okay, so if you think about this glenohumeral joint, you have the acromion and the coracoid process, which is where the biceps brachii originates. The two heads of the biceps brachii unite and insert on the radial tuberosity. And when this muscle contracts, it brings the radius toward the humerus bone. So the radius moves through the action of this muscle. The origin doesn't move when you contract this muscle. You can keep the shoulder stable and in one spot and bend the elbow. So that's what we mean by origin and insertion. You don't need to know the origins and insertions of all the muscles. There are only a few that I want you to know the origins and insertions for, and I will let you know which ones those are. Okay, now the orientation of the muscles themselves. The muscles sit deep to a layer of tissue that we call the deep fascia. The deep fascia is deep to the superficial fascia, which is the subcutaneous layer that sits deep to the skin. So you remember when we learned the skin, we learned about that subcutaneous layer or the hypodermis, and I said it's not really part of the integument, but it's not really part of anything else. That's okay. It's this padded layer with adipose and areolar connective tissue that sits between the skin and the deep fascia. And then the deep fascia has another layer called the epimysium that connects it to the muscle. Okay, so we have these layers, but this is the orientation of the muscle under the skin. So we have a tendon at the ends, at both ends of a muscle. That tendon connects with and kind of becomes the deep fascia. The deep fascia connects to the tendon. It's going to separate individual muscles. So you'll have deep fascia that surround, for example, the biceps brachii muscle and separate it from the triceps brachii and the brachialis in your upper arm. It also binds together muscles with a similar function, for example, the two parts of the biceps brachii. And it gives a pathway for distributing blood vessels and nerves. We're also going to have other layers of tissue within the muscle that help to distribute these blood vessels and nerves within the muscle tissue itself. And then the deep fascia is also important for filling spaces between muscles because the shape of the muscles doesn't necessarily fill in all the space. All right, the epimysium is deep to the deep fascia. Okay, so we have the tendon that connects to the deep fascia, and then we have the epimysium that goes all the way around and connects to the tissue of the muscle itself. So that's this loose connective tissue layer here. Epi, you remember, means upon, and it's going to surround each part of the muscle. So for example, the deep fascia might go around both parts of the biceps brachii. Each of those parts of the biceps brachii is going to be surrounded by its own epimysium. And then the muscle is divided into groups called fascicles. And we've seen this term fasci before. We had fasciculi in the brain. You remember those were groups of axons going in the same direction. Fascicles are groups of muscle cells going in the same direction and working together. Each fascicle is surrounded by a perimysium. Peri means around, which is going to separate the fascicles and also fill in the spaces between the fascicles and provide a pathway for arteries and veins and nerves to supply to the individual cells. So the muscles are made up of fascicles. The fascicle, each fascicle is made up of a number of muscle fibers, which is what we call muscle cells in skeletal muscles. The muscle fibers are really long, thin cells. So this is one muscle fiber. Here is another muscle fiber. Here is another muscle fiber. These are all part of a fascicle. Now over here, what we're seeing is a longitudinal section through a muscle. Okay, and these white lines here are the endomysium that separate the individual muscle fibers of a muscle. And then here's a cross section through a muscle, And we can see the individual muscle fibers here with the endomysium around them, and then there are these groups, these breaks between groups of those fibers, and this whole thing is a fascicle, okay, surrounded by a perimysium. The epimysium would be around this whole muscle here, so part of this layer would be epimysium, and then there would be another one around this whole muscle. Okay, I hope that makes sense. All right, so let's review the parts of the muscle. We have the tendon. Actually, you could pause the video here if you want, see if you can name them, and then I'll go in and try to name them. Okay, if you start the video again, here we go. Tendon connects to the deep fascia. Deep fascia is superficial to the epimysium. The epimysium surrounds the muscle. The muscle is made up of fascicles, which are surrounded by a perimysium. The fascicle is made up of muscle fibers or muscle cells, which are surrounded by an endomysium. And that's the end of this section. Ooh, one more slide, which is, this is a model of an arm. And so you can see these gray things here are the tendons connecting the muscle to the bone. In some cases, connecting muscles to each other. Here's the big tendon and aponeurosis on the back of your triceps brachii muscle there, connecting all three parts of the triceps brachii together. And then each of these muscles would be wrapped in an epimysium, and this whole thing would be wrapped in deep fascia. Okay, obviously that's not shown on this model, so we can see the details of the muscles. All right, in the next section, we're going to start with the microscopic structure of the muscle, and we're going to go into much more detail.